especially having to do with the war in Gaza and many events surrounding that. I'm guessing there are some people who say, oh, well, Tony Blinken, now that I've heard the stories of the persecution his family faced because they were Jewish, and now that I know he's got Jewish roots and professes that that persecution was kind of the root of his worldview about wanting to, let's say, alleviate suffering, defend people and so on. But I'm sure some people think, well, the simple fact that he's got Jewish roots means that he's in the bag for Israel. That's an unfortunately typical reduction that's happening in our political conversations these days. So let's say I were to say that to you. Oh, well, you may defend your and the Biden administration's record on Israel and many other things, but persuade me that you're not biased. And what I'm really asking is, how can you perform your abilities as a political figure, as a civil servant, whatever it is, while incorporating the strength of your personal and family background without biasing yourself against others?
Sure, and look, I get that. I understand that reaction. I certainly heard it. I guess I'd say two things, Stephen. First, I'm in the bag for the United States. I had the extraordinary privilege of representing our country for 4 years around the world as Secretary of State. And first, foremost, my job was to do my best to try to represent the interests of my country, my fellow citizens, as well as our values. There are plenty of judgments to go around about whether I and we did that well, indifferently, or badly. That's for others to make, but that's what my job was, and that's what I try to do every day. Second, it's precisely because of this extraordinary formative experience of our family stories and the suffering that my own immediate relatives had gone through that I think, and I hope, made me deeply sensitive to the suffering of anyone, Jewish or Palestinian, of whatever nationality, of whatever background, of whatever faith. I think it wouldn't do justice to my own history and that legacy to not be deeply sensitive to the plight of others. There's no hierarchy of suffering. When I looked at what happened on October 7th, it resonated deeply with me because it was the worst slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust. I felt that very strongly. But I also felt very strongly what happened every day after October 7th, including the horrific suffering of Palestinian boys and girls, women and men, who were caught in this horrific crossfire of Hamas's initiation, something that they hadn't started and were powerless to stop.
When you look back over the history of Israel, how can you best describe how this country went from being a largely celebrated Middle East democracy, which was under attack almost continuously by its neighbors who opposed Western values, which aligned Israel further with the U.S., and Israel defended itself and it got stronger militarily as well as economically, and that was the reputation for a few decades, to now where the public sentiment globally, in many corners at least, has been shifted towards basically called a settler colonial villain. That's the progressive configuration at least. Can you describe the degree to which that was a change in perception, a change in facts on the ground, things that Israel did prima facie wrong to bring that reputation onto itself versus campaigns against it, etc.?
Yeah, so much goes into that. I could spend the entire time on that question, but just a few thoughts. What you'll hear many say, especially those who went through the Holocaust, went through World War II, is they despised us and disdained us when we were weak and meek, going off to the slaughter. Now they despise us and disdain us for being strong. It's a worldview that, in a sense, no matter what you do, the haters are going to hate.
It's also a good political strategy for autocrats in that part of the world, a different version of bread and circuses, I guess.
Yes, there's something to that as well. Part of the problem that we're living through right now is an absence of any kind of historical grounding, a lack of context. And so, in brief, what happened in the Middle East with Israel? When Israel was founded, when it declared its independence, there was a partition that was recognized and voted by the United Nations. It was not accepted in the moment by Arab countries, which urged the Palestinians to push back against it. There was a war of independence, and of course, many Palestinians were made refugees, just as a roughly equal number of Jews were made refugees from Arab countries at the time. And then you had decades during which Arab countries didn't accept Israel's existence. You had wars. You had 67, you had 73, but then ultimately you had a change and a breakthrough. Egypt, Jordan, and then others came around. And then efforts were made to finally resolve the question, including the question for the Palestinians. But unfortunately, in that period, Palestinian leadership rejected many of the settlements that were proposed.
We're up to Oslo now?
We're up to Oslo and then Camp David, and right up to the early 2000s.
I had an interesting conversation the other day with a young person who was really interested in this political story and definitely knew quite a bit about the current events. They, however, did not know about the Oslo Accords at all, which surprised me because to me it doesn't seem that long ago and it was foundational. This gets to what you were saying a bit ago about living in a, I don't know if it's fair to call it an ahistoric age.
I think it's probably pretty fair. You've got Oslo, you've got what President Clinton did at Camp David, where the offer on the table for the Palestinians was about 97% of the West Bank. And they said no. The leadership couldn't say yes.
And if you had to explain those decades of rejection, those various plans, maybe going back to Arafat and up through Hamas, how would you shorthand it?
I think part of it was a rejection, actually, of a two-state solution. Every time things were moving in a positive direction, Oslo, you mentioned, and then later, in the early 2000s, the Arab Peace Initiative, which was a big moment, Arab countries got behind the two-state solution. Who came along immediately and tried to literally blow it up? Hamas, perpetrating horrific terrorist attacks after Oslo and after the Arab Peace Initiative. The biggest opponent of the two-state solution throughout has been Hamas. One of the things I say to Israelis and others who say, oh, we can't make an accommodation with the Palestinians now because it would be to give Hamas a big victory. No, it's exactly the opposite. The ultimate defeat of Hamas and everything it represents would be the realization of a Palestinian state with a secure Israel. So you have decades of Arab rejection, then you have a couple of decades of Palestinian rejection, but what do we have over the last 15 or so years? In effect, Israeli rejection, a belief that the status quo could prevail and that it didn't need to accommodate the rightful aspirations of Palestinians for a state of their own. This is in some ways not hard to understand. The Israelis got out of Gaza in 2005. They pulled up every settlement, every settler. What happened? Hamas came in, managed to push out the more moderate Palestinian Authority, and then repeatedly launched attacks against Israel from Gaza, ultimately culminating in October 7th. So from the Israeli perspective, it's, wait a minute, we gave up the land. We gave up the settlements. We got out. And what did we get? We got Hamas. Similarly, in the north, after occupying southern Lebanon for 18 years, they left. And what happened? Hezbollah came in and launched attacks against northern Israel repeatedly. So if you put yourself in their shoes, I think their feeling was, decades of rejection by Arabs. Then we had extremist groups who, again, rejected our existence and sought our destruction. But then finally, they got to a place where they thought they had a status quo that could prevail, where after the Second Intifada, there was relative quiet and relative calm. And I think Israelis were lulled into a sense that, okay, we don't have to do anything.
Tell me any regrets you're willing to admit about how you and the Biden administration handled the Gaza war?
Oh, look, there are regrets every day. There can't not be when you look at the toll of the suffering. As we were looking at it, we were trying to accomplish a few things at the same time. One was to try to ensure that October 7th never happened again.
I've heard you say that before, and I'm curious what that actually means, because there are a lot of Israelis who say the only way to make sure October 7th never happens again is that we don't have Palestinians living next door to us. Full stop.
I understand that response, but I think it's both a fantasy and a fallacy. The reality is this. There are something like 7 million Jews in Israel, and they're probably approaching 6 million Palestinians between the West Bank and Israel and Gaza. Neither is going anywhere, despite whatever fantasies some people may have on both sides. The question then is, if people are going to have to live together, what's the best way to do that, such that each can fulfill their aspirations in peace, in security? And I don't see any other way, despite the fact that when you say it now, it sounds incredibly naive. I don't see any other way than through two states.
I've been reading lately about some developments in the West Bank, particularly among several Arab tribal elders who have said they want to get rid of the Palestinian Authority. It sounds like they're afraid that they are next after Gaza. They call the Palestinian Authority corrupt, bloodthirsty, and they want to set up their own tribal emirates that would normalize relations with Israel and join the Abraham Accords. Is that a viable path to peace in Israel of some type, or is that total pipe dream?
There's a lot that goes into this, not the least of which is, yes, there are huge challenges with the Palestinian Authority, including the corruption, including the inability to really deliver what people need and want. Reform of the authority is one of the things I think that's essential going forward, so that it can actually effectively represent the interests and needs of the Palestinian people. Absent that, it's going to be very challenging. That also breeds tremendous frustration, including what you just alluded to. But there's something else that the authority, for all of its manifest problems and faults, brought to the table, which has been nonviolence, finding ways to fulfill the aspirations of Palestinians without resorting to violence. The alternative to that is something we've seen and can't possibly accept. I was talking before about how I think the Israelis got comfortable with the status quo, and in trying to perpetuate that status quo of not having to address the aspirations of Palestinians for state, they also pursued policies that made it very difficult for the Palestinian Authority to be effective. For instance, starving it of resources, trying to keep it down, and even, in the case of Gaza, allowing Hamas to run things, allowing it to get resources from Qatar, because Israelis believe, governments believe, that Hamas's only interest was in consolidating its power in Gaza, not necessarily in attacking Israel, and that proved to be a fatal mistake. But also because there was a real interest on the part of some of the Israeli leadership to make sure that the Palestinian Authority could never become strong and effective, because that would mean Israel would actually have a partner with which to negotiate and to try to decide the future, including the future for a Palestinian state.
A lot of these points you're making now add up to or contribute to the argument that Netanyahu is a particular type of political opportunist. I know that President Biden himself and many members of the administration complained about just not being able to trust him. You spent a lot of time with him in a variety of rooms, I assume.
Mm-hmm.
Give me your best assessment of Netanyahu as a strategic thinker and as a trustworthy partner, whether for the U.S. or some of the neighbors.
Whatever one thinks of the Prime Minister, it's a mistake and it's a simplification to attribute to him everything one may not like about what Israel does. At least since October 7th, I'd say 75–80% of the Israeli public has been behind the basic policies of the government. Even the 50 or so percent that probably detest Netanyahu.
And we should say that was a big reversal, because during the judicial reform debate, it was almost the opposite, was it not?
Yeah, that's right. In the case of Israelis, October 7th was truly a day that lives in infamy. The national trauma cannot possibly be overstated, just as in the days since October 7th, the trauma for Palestinians can't be overstated. What we've had in both directions, and it was already there, of course, but it's only been accentuated and accelerated since then, is dehumanization, an inability on each side to see the humanity in the other. Breaking through that, I think, is the most important, challenging, and difficult task that lays ahead if there's going to be a future that actually does justice to Israelis and Palestinians alike.
What do you see as the drivers of the dehumanization that you're describing, whether it's having to do with Israel and the Palestinians, but you can point at many, many places around the globe, really at any time in history. So I guess what I'm really asking is, do you see this as a core component of human nature that's maybe inescapable, or is it something more flexible than that?
I think we are living a unique moment. President Biden referred to it repeatedly as an inflection point, something that comes along maybe every 70–80 years. If you look at the course of history, I think it explains to a great extent so much of what we're experiencing, including this issue of dehumanization. I've been doing this now, foreign policy, national security, America's place in the world, for more than 30 years. I don't remember any point in my experience where we had a greater multiplicity, a greater complexity, a greater interconnectedness, a greater rapidity of challenges and problems, all coming together.
Let's go to Syria for a moment. After nearly 15 years of civil war in Syria, it took only 11 days for this rebel offensive to oust Bashar al-Assad, which ended his family's rule of 5 decades. This came very near the end of the Biden presidency. What did you know as that was happening, and did the U.S. contribute in any way?
I wish I could tell you that we saw it coming. We didn't. It was a surprise to us. I think it was a surprise to pretty much everyone. But when it came, I have to say, for so many of us, especially those of us who've been involved in the early days of the Syrian civil war and all the horrors that brought, there was a great sense of not just satisfaction of the departure of Assad, but also a sense of finally the possibility. This was and is an opportunity for the Syrian people for the first time in decades not to live either under a dictator, under the manipulations of foreign powers or under the thumb of some kind of extremist terrorist organization like ISIS. We worked very hard in the very little time that we had left to try to seize that, to try to engage the new authorities as they were emerging, to work very closely with countries in the region, the Arab countries, Turkey and others, to see what we could do about helping to support the more positive forces that have been unleashed in Syria.
Tell us what you know about the new president, Ahmed al-Sharaa. This is a former Al-Qaeda commander.
That's right.
With a $10 million bounty out on him, but now he's the president, and he's talked about peace and reconciliation, including with Israel. So, and I know one of your former colleagues, Roger Karsten, said he walked away from a meeting very impressed with his presentation, at least. What's your take?
Yeah, I sent several of my former colleagues to engage with the new Syrian authorities, including al-Sharaa. And you're right about his past. The real question is, what's his present? Everything that he said over the last 6 to 9 months has been what you want to hear, has been very positive about not only the future that he wants for his country, but also for its relationships with countries in the region and around the world. The test is, of course, not what he says, but what he does. And he's got a massively challenging job precisely because of the nature of the country, the many different communities in opposition to each other, including, for example, the Kurds, with whom we've had a critical partnership in trying first to defeat ISIS and then to keep it down. But I have to tell you, Stephen, I applaud what the Trump administration, what President Trump has done in trying to seize this opportunity, in removing the sanctions from al-Sharaa and from Syria, in opening the door to investment, in trying to work on how we can support the efforts of this country to stand effectively on its own 2 feet.
As an American, is it naive to think, oh, well, with Syria moving in the direction it's moving in now, then Iran really remains the last stronghold of anti-Western, strong anti-Israel sentiment in that region, and therefore we really have reached a new stage? Is that naive? Is this just another, chapter in a book that keeps telling the same story?
I think we have reached a new stage if we take advantage of it. For example, translating the very significant military achievements of Israel into actual enduring strategic success. Those are two very different questions, because you're exactly right. Iran really is on its heels in many ways. It's lost its best proxies, or at least had them dramatically diminished, whether it's Hezbollah, whether it's Hamas, whether it's its own capacity. At the same time, we've seen something new, the real possibility that this region could be integrated. These countries could come together in common security pacts, in economic interaction that can better the lives of their people, and create a region that's focused on actually building positive things. So that possibility is real, but I don't think it can be achieved, or it's certainly not fully achieved, absent the resolution of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. That is the wrench in the works that one way or another is going to have to be dealt with, because absent dealing with it, it does put real limitations on how far a number of these countries can go in actually genuinely normalizing relations with Israel and building this new region. You can see it if you can touch it, but it still needs that resolution if it's really going to become real.
Coming up after the break, more on Iran and China too. And we asked Blinken about the Trump administration laying off more than 1,000 employees of the State Department. I'm Stephen Dubner. This is Freakonomics Radio. We'll be right back. Freakonomics Radio is sponsored by PNC Bank. Some people think podcasts about data are boring. Yeah, data is boring, but it explains why things happen the way they do. It helps us see and understand the bigger picture. It's like banking with PNC. It might seem boring, just